Our first session of the day will be a discussion with authors Ben Goldfarb and Leila Philip, moderated by Bob Boucher. Bob is the founding president of the Superior Bio-Conservancy. His interests include protecting and restoring keystone species and ecosystems and bioregional landscape linkages. His 2020 study, titled Hydrological Impact of Beaver Habitat Restoration in the Milwaukee River Watershed, modeled how beaver restoration would support flood mitigation, biodiversity, and provide billions of dollars in ecological services. We will put a link to that study in the chat. Please welcome our moderator for this session, Bob Boucher.
Thank you for joining us today. Ben Goldfarb is an environmental journalist whose work has appeared in Science, Mother Jones, Orion Magazine, The Guardian, and many other publications. He's the author of Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. His next book, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, will be published by W.W. Norton and Company in September, and it's available now. Leila Philip is an award-winning author whose most recent book, Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America, is a New York Times Editor's Choice and an NPR Science Friday book selection. The Guggenheim Fellow, Philip has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She was a contributing columnist at the Boston Globe and teaches in the Environmental Studies program at the College of Holy Cross, where she holds the Brooks Chair in Humanities. I'd like to recommend both their books because they're excellent. Ben, since Eager was published in 2018, you have spoken to numerous groups across the country about the ecological value of beavers. Leila, since Beaverland was published last December, you've been crossing the country for book tours and speaking engagements. Can you share a bird's eye perspective on what's happening on the ground in terms of beaver advocacy and or beaver restoration? For example, is there a region or project that stands out for you?
Sure, I'll take first crack at that. So I live in Colorado, where beaver restoration is very much in full swing. And down here, because our streams are sort of historically degraded, of course, as they are all over the country, by overgrazing, mining, other impacts. We have a deficit, I would say, in many watersheds of suitable beaver habitat, right? And the solution there, in many cases, is the construction of beaver dam analogs. These beaver mimicry structures that basically serve as beaver kickstarters. They kind of lay the groundwork for beaver recovery and reintroduction and natural recolonization in systems where beavers might not otherwise thrive because they've been historically degraded. And I think that often you hear beaver dam analogs discussed as this kind of standalone project, but of course they really work the best in partnership with the beavers themselves, right, who maintain BDAs and build new, better dams of their own. So this kind of beaver dam analog construction assisting natural beaver recolonization is happening at an enormous scale in Colorado. There are certainly projects that have built hundreds of structures and restored many miles of degraded streams and have seen a pretty spectacular beaver response as a result of that. So yeah, down here in the Southwest, because we don't we tend to have watersheds that are a little bit steeper, flashier, a little more disconnected potentially than yours in the Midwest. That's the sort of thing that we have to do to sort of facilitate beaver recovery. And no doubt there are plenty of degraded streams in the Midwest that would also benefit from beaver dam analog construction and that form of low-tech process-based stream restoration. And we're certainly seeing enormous success with it here in Colorado.
Thank you, Ben. Leila, what did you tell us about what you've been seeing?
Well, I just want to second Ben's enthusiasm for that work. It's really exciting. Here in the East, where we tend to have a lot of beavers working, I've actually seen a lot of interesting work, analog work, BDA work going on in the Chesapeake area, which is interesting, where they're trying to get beavers back for stream restoration and water storage and flood control and all those things, and to help clean up the Chesapeake Bay. But what I'd like to bring some light on is the really interesting work that's going on around the country for policy work in terms of beaver management, because I think this is really important. And there's some just important shifts that are, I think, I would say, kind of moving the beaver believer movement a little bit more toward the mainstream in a really significant way. So, California passed statewide beaver initiative to support projects that harness beavers, and there's a new beaver management policy that's prioritizing non-lethal deterrence. That's huge. And a statewide beaver working group. Oregon also has passed legislation. Now it isn't up for a final vote yet, but it is removing the predatory status of beavers. So if that is, finalized, that also will be huge. And in Congress, State Representative Susan Delvain has put forward the Developing Alternative Mitigation Systems Dams Beavers Act. And again, this is really significant, where we've got policy on a national level recognizing the value of what beavers do, and that would really put beavers in the running for federal monies that are being harnessed toward watershed projects. So I think in all these ways, the value that beavers can contribute in terms of their value toward river health is being recognized, and that's significant. And we can't have beavers in tributaries and streams and healthy rivers if we don't have habitat for them, and if they aren't recognized for the value they're doing. So I think this is really significant. And back here in Easton at the Beaver Institute, these national working groups, which are national, so they're not literally located in the East, but the nexus is here, working on these issues throughout the country. This is huge. This has really taken the recognition that we need to look at how to address beaver management in all the different states, which right now varies widely. So for example, here in Connecticut, you can't translocate beavers. Even if I had a problem beaver and I had a place to put it, I can't move it. Without such a special permit, it's not really feasible. So things like that, getting a national database of what the different regulations are would be very valuable. So, and one final thing, I think there's an exciting and really important idea, if my 5 minutes is not up, that I know folks at the Beaver Institute in the National Working Group are working on, which is a beaver habitat lease program, where there could be financial incentives for landowners to set aside habitat for beaver. And that is huge, because we're living in a moment where we basically have the tragedy of the commons, where we have degraded habitat, degraded stream systems, a devastated wetland system. We know that, and yet we can't ask private landowners to pay the price for repairing those systems by setting aside land that they might need to farm. So how do we compensate a farmer or a landowner to put aside important land so that beavers can do the valuable work they need to do? We need incentives for that, just conservation easements, the way we've had for other species, and that's going to be huge.
Thank you. That's excellent. Yeah, having this involved potentially in a farm bill, incentivizing across the country would be terrific. Ben, your book covers a lot of ground across North America. You write that in researching Eager, you traveled from the slick rock deserts of Utah to the hardwood forests of Vermont to a highway side canal in Napa, California. I met beavers on farms and beavers in forests, beavers in raging rivers and beavers in irrigation ditches, beavers in wilderness areas and beavers in Walmart parking lots. What should our audience know about beavers in order to understand how they are able to survive and even thrive in such disparate settings?
Yeah, great question, Bob. I mean, certainly they're incredibly adaptable, and obviously they create their own habitat, right? That's sort of their genius in a lot of ways. And I mean, one example of that I'll add to the litany of places that Bob mentioned. Last month, I went to Alaska to report an article about sort of the northern expansion of beavers. As the climate warms, their ponds don't freeze to bottom as readily, and the kind of the willow line is pushing north onto the tundra, and beavers, sort of this incredibly adaptable creature, are moving onto the tundra. And there, it was just incredible to see beaver innovation in a sense. The lodges were gargantuan because they had just packed them with so many layers of mud insulation to defend against the Arctic winter. And the ponds and canals were incredibly deep, I think because they freeze to bottom, right? And they're trying to, in the Arctic, and they're trying to deepen those ponds to prevent that freezing to bottom. So it was just kind of amazing to see this, again, this beaver innovation in a relatively novel habitat for them. So they're just an incredibly adaptable organism. And I think one thing worth noting is that the only thing that limits beaver presence is essentially our tolerance, right? I mean, these are potentially incredibly urban animals. They'll live wherever we let them live. In Seattle, I think something like 75% of available beaver habitat is presently occupied, right? And again, in one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. These animals are not like grizzly bears or wolves. These are creatures that very happily live amongst us if we allow them to, through things like flow devices and tree fencing and other, relatively simple, low-tech beaver conflict mitigation systems, right, that we need to incentivize, as Leila mentioned. Bob mentioned the Walmart parking lot, which I think is just a beautiful little illustration, again, of how urban these animals can truly be. That was a site in Logan, Utah, that I visited working on this book, where beavers had moved into this little pocket wetland next to a parking lot of this giant Walmart. They had created this great little postage stamp of wetland fish and wildlife habitat. And, I think that for most of human history, the default has been to trap them out of a place like that. Not necessarily because they were creating conflict, but because they created the perception of future potential conflict, right? There are beavers here. Let's get the beavers out of here before anything bad happens, before they flood anything. But instead, in partnership with Utah State University, the Walmart basically put in this kind of iterative adaptive management plan where we're going to start by putting in a flow device and see if that reduces the water level a little bit and and mitigates the possibility of flooding, and if that doesn't work, then we'll do some live trapping and relocation. But the default was not removing the beavers, which again is sort of the default approach of communities all over the country. The default was you begin with non-lethal mitigation with coexistence, and you adapt from that point if you have to, right? So again, these are incredibly adaptive animals that will live anywhere we let them live, and the only thing that limits their habitat is essentially our own ability to tolerate them, and in some quarters, fortunately, that's changing.
Thank you, Ben. Leila, beavers are often referred to as a nuisance or pest, especially across the Midwest. In your book, you write that Lewis Henry Morgan, who studied and documented an enormous beaver complex near Marquette, Michigan, which I'm familiar with, and he started this in 1862. And he was the first person to really recognize that beavers are the only animals apart from man that deliberately and continually transform their environment. As humans, we prefer to be the ones who are in charge or in control of the outcomes, such as the form of a river. What does a river look like? How do we change that narrative from nuisance to industrious ecosystem engineer?
Wow, what a great question. I feel like you could have a whole conference about that. So thanks for throwing it to me. Ben and I were saying the other day that we'd like to have just a whole conversation between the two of us about that question. But just to say, great answer, Ben. And following around fur trappers, I went behind a lot of Walmarts and Home Depots. But to answer this question, I actually want to take you here to Woodstock, Connecticut, and share my screen and share a very quick story of not just landscape transformation, but I think, human transformation, because this is an example of how in one example, sort of people can learn. So if you'll bear with me, I'm gonna be allowed to share the screen, I think, Hannah, right?
Yeah.
Can I do that now? I'm going to show a couple slides, and I just want to share a little story with you, because this is an example. I mean, Morgan was an industrialist. He went out to the UP to help his railroad friends basically build the railroads that were going to extract the iron ore that was going to destroy the beaver habitat. And then he had this problem of falling in love with beavers inadvertently, but he was still looking at them from that 19th century viewpoint of we can have it all. We can extract away without consequence. So I'm going to go to the top here and get going with my 5 minutes. Okay, so this is a little area near where I live. In Beaverland, I write about discovering that the beavers that had fled my local beaver pond, I found them later in an area called Rocky Hill. Recently, was able to fly a drone over and take a look at the bottom section, and you can see it's being transformed into a mini Beaverland. It's just gorgeous. In July, they built a lodge. You can see it there. And what's significant about this, and this is there are 3 dams now, and this is the bottom dam. It's this beautiful, delicate structure that's now holding millions of gallons of water. And what's significant about this story, and this is the crowded east. So this is the first dam that these beavers built. And this is the big drumlin called Rocky Hill that is to the right of it. And Woodstock is basically a drumlin field, which is a series of glacially carved hills with streams running around them. So historically, beavers would have been there filling all those stream corridors with water. But since colonization, they've been pretty much dried out. So in 1934, there was really not much water here at all, and no ponds, because in 1934, there were no beavers. Beavers were extirpated from Connecticut and only reintroduced in 1914. And they were reintroduced to Union, Connecticut, about 10 miles away, but only 20 years earlier. So you can see no water, no beavers. By 1990, this same spot looks like this. Beavers are here. There's a major beaver pond here to the right, and there's the lodge. It still exists today. And the beaver site that I am studying now and watching the story of and want to share the story of, here's the dam, was full of water. By 1990, humans had taken advantage of this, and the landowner who owns the farm now bought the farm in 1970, sorry. And in 1930, they had made a pond here, left this beaver worked pond alone, but they had manipulated this pond and built a berm and dug this pond out. So what's interesting is that the beavers disappear. They're probably trapped out. Again, this whole area is dried out. When I find my beavers that I write about in the book Beaverland, they're living here. This is their lodge. So flash forward to 2019, 2016. The beavers are up here, but this is dry. And this is dry because the beavers are content to stay here, and they were historically kept out of here. So the stream has pretty much disappeared. It's an example of how a stream can just go under and it comes back up down here. And what's remarkable about what I watched happen recently is that the beavers, from kind of a little tragedy, their dam was breached in November. They fled the upper pond. It was a freaky warm winter, so they actually came down to this area, managed to fell some trees, and I've been documenting it since. I've had wildlife cameras up. Two just 2 beavers. We think they're 2 years old. They've managed to create a pond here. And then you saw the drone footage of this lower pond here. And they have built a dam here, and they have that dam here. So in a matter of months, I should say I'm grateful to Dr. Denise Berkstead, who I write about in Beaverland. She helped me put these, do some of these studies of the water. Mike Callahan from the Beaver Institute came down and helped me measure the dam, and I've been monitoring it since, and it looks like this. And what's really special, I think, about this story and why I wanted to share it with you is that the landowner, and here's the growing lodge. They just built this in July, and it's not a very impressive lodge, and it's a bit worrying because the beavers are young and the water's not very deep, and it's now almost October. Are they going to get deep enough water? They need at least 3 feet to get through the winter. Are they going to be able to get a food cache? We don't know if they're a mated pair. So I'm not sure they're going to survive. The rest of the lodge didn't make it from the Exodus. But what's wonderful and remarkable is that this stream has been reconnected. Millions of gallons of water are here. This is an incredibly rich biodiversity hub now of, in spring, all kinds of migrating ducks and birds were there. And the landowner has become really interested in the beavers and really interested in having the beavers stay. So I just gave him a copy of Beaverland in December after it came out. I thanked him for letting me be on the land all those years and walk it. And, you know, I think education, understanding why people do what they do. The dam was broken because there was concern that they might flood that road. Mike Callahan came down and talked to him about the alternative coexistence strategies of when the beavers move back up, because they probably will, putting in a pond leveler. He's open to that. So I think in the future, this is going to become a really dynamic, exciting hub of beavers for the area. Previous to this, I learned that the beavers had just been coming and going because the dam kept getting broken and they had to flee. And probably they were, you know, these beavers survived, but maybe some years they just didn't. So I think the way we change the narrative is by trying to educate people, trying to figure out what their needs are. He was a good steward of the land. He just needed to learn about beavers. But I think you really have to approach people with understanding and really and a lot of respect, and kind of what I learned is sort of slowly. And another reason why I have wildlife cameras up is so that I can share the footage with the landowner and they can see the beavers up close. And that's really, really made a difference, because these beavers are completely fetching and they're very young. They talk to each other all the time. They were clearly super insecure back in January. It was like, they were like, what are we doing? I mean, I've been sharing pictures of them with Glynis Hood and other, people. And so anyway, I think my 5 minutes are up, but I just wanted to share that as an example of, how we really change the narrative is how we change our relationship to the natural world. But case by case, I think education.
Thank you, Leila. That's a great story for sharing that. And I think there's variations of that story that are happening across many places in the Midwest. And it's a matter of this coexistence and realizing the benefits and how much water can be stored and how basically beavers restore the wetlands. Each of you write about the history of North America, a continent, and how the near extirpation of beavers during the height of the fur trade dramatically and changed our landscape and river function. The term ecological amnesia gets used to describe how we no longer understand the role that beavers played in shaping our continent and how our rivers once functioned. The hydrology was quite different. What is an example of something our Midwest audience should remember about beavers to help us value or coexist with them? Or can you expand on this concept of ecological amnesia?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bob, and thanks, Leila, for sharing that fantastic story. I really enjoyed that. I think that one important point that gets at the ecological amnesia concept is that when we trapped out several 100 million beavers during the course of the industrial fur trade, we profoundly changed the landscape's capacity to support beavers, right? Beavers, of course, as engineers of their own habitat, create the conditions in which they themselves thrive. In a beaver-rich stream, all of those beaver dams are essentially acting as speed bumps, right? Slowing water down and spreading water onto the floodplain. And when you lose all of those beaver-built speed bumps, there's nothing checking the velocity of water, and you often get this catastrophic erosion and incision and downcutting, that results in streams that are trapped within their banks and can't access the floodplain. And that's an incredibly difficult situation in which to be a beaver, right? If the stream is trapped within its banks like a fire hose, that's a hard place to build a dam. Beavers want to access the floodplain, and if a stream is downcut by 15 or 20 feet, they can't do that. And that's those are really the situations in which beaver dam analogs are valuable, because they slow water, capture some sediment, bump up that stream bed a little bit, and give the animals themselves a chance to access that floodplain again. But I think that's a really important point that is often lost, is that we can't simply expect these animals to recolonize on their own. Certainly they do that in many cases, but in many degraded watersheds, we do need to give them a leg up, I think, because again, when we destroyed these animals, we destroyed the landscape. We don't think about beaver trapping in the same terms as the industrial deforestation of New England, or the busting of the sod in the Midwest, or gold mining in the Sierra Nevada, right? We don't consider fur trapping sort of a seminal ecological catastrophe, but in some ways it was the original sin. It preceded all of those things, and again, it changed the landscape's capacity to support beavers, and that's a big part of why our beaver populations remain really depressed today.
And Leila, what are your thoughts on that?
Gosh, there's so much to say. On the ecological amnesia, on which aspect?
Well, I think just from your own perspective of this recognition of that we've forgotten what we had in terms of the hydrology of the United States, and in terms of that, by recognizing their restorative capacity, just in the slides that you just showed, just how do you think this movement and this change will occur across the United States?
Well, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that it's not just the water. The water we can see is just the beginning, but the beaver damming, and to pick up, thank you, Ben, that was a great answer. The water that we can see is just the beginning, in the sense that, first of all, there's the visible basin of water, and then there's that great invisible sponge of water underneath. So the average beaver pond holds 3 times as much water underneath and contributes to the hyperrheic zone, right? So that this whole idea that one of the things that really blew my mind studying beavers and learning about rivers was this idea that underneath the surface channel of a river, there's another flow of water through the land. And I think that's really hard for people, the average person, to kind of get their head around, if you're not a river scientist, that there's sort of another river flowing under the river. But it's a vital part of our water system. And so in a way, that's the story also of what I watched these 2 little beavers do, right? They went to a dry area and they didn't dam up running water. They actually pulled subsurface water up from below to build their pond. So they reconnected a hidden section of the stream system. But I think what I was getting at is that the beaver damming complexes, and I think this dovetails with what Ben was saying, they set in motion hydrologic and geologic and geochemical and ecological and environmental changes that we're really only beginning to fully understand and therefore be able to quantify. So we've called them a keystone species for a long time because we could see their impact on animal species. So We know their impact on biodiversity. We can say you have beavers and plants and animal species increased by 30%. We can measure the water and say you have 15 times more plankton. But I think what river scientists are now starting to say to us is it's actually even bigger than that, because their impact on the hyporheic zone through the contribution of these beaver damming complexes is really profound in terms of the contribution to the health of the river system. So if you start thinking about beavers as part of river ecology, not as separate from it, then they're really quite important to the watershed. And I think one of the things we really need to start thinking about, I mean, I know like wildlife managers and people who manage parks and conservation lands, they have to balance all kinds of needs of hunters and trappers and people who want to use the land for different reasons and different species of animals. But sometimes I hear people taking out beavers and say, oh, I need to get rid of the water there because I need a cornfield so that I can have, grouse for hunters. But I think that may be so, and that may be the right decision, but they need to think it's a lot more than just taking out a pond of water, right? There's an ecological system that's being removed. So the full value of what's being taken out when you take out beavers needs to be understood and put into the equation. I think that is really an important shift that still needs to happen in the Midwest, maybe in particular, where it seems like there's a lot of confusion about what benefits fish or not. And, it's not just about how we're going to face climate change, it's how we're going to face, biodiversity and loss of all kinds of species, right?
Well, those are both, thank you both. Those are excellent answers. Hannah's going to field some questions that came in from the chat. And it seems that from both of you that really our rivers are impoverished without beavers, and that they bloom in the hyporheic zone. So Leila and Ben, thank you so much. I'm going to let Hannah come in with these questions from the chat, and excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, really great presentation. Thank you both for sharing, your wisdom and your experiences. Leila, kind of going off of your last question, could you discuss any research that quantifies how beavers help convert flooding liabilities into groundwater assets? For example, like might the return of healthy beaver populations help communities regenerate declining groundwater supplies?
Well, I think, the study that, Bob did out in 2021 in Milwaukee is a really important study, University of Wisconsin, and everybody should look that up. I mean, that is really significant, looking at the watershed resiliency and how much flood water storage was created by putting beavers up in the watershed. There's a study at the University of Helsinki. So those are really good examples of water storage. And anytime you get water storage, then the water is going to go down into the aquifer. I actually would be interested to know, because recently I've become interested in this question. We have I think, a problem with dwindling groundwater supplies that we really haven't talked about as much. We've been so focused on the issues of wildfire and flooding and drought from our warming climate. We haven't really been thinking in the news about just dwindling groundwater, at least out east. So I'm actually not aware of recent studies. Maybe Ben is. Ben, are you about just groundwater? But I'm sure they're out there. I really think people should look at that Milwaukee study that I mentioned in Beaverland and University of Helsinki as a start. Ben, do you have anything to suggest to that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Leila, that groundwater resources through beaver storage have been sort of not fully quantified. Certainly that's true. I mean, I think that the question of converting floodwater to groundwater is that's a fascinating one. Study. There's lots of fantastic research that's come out of England, the University of Exeter, where Eurasian beavers have been reintroduced in recent years, largely for their flood control benefits. And they have shown that a single colony of beavers, building a dozen or so dams in a stream, is capable of capturing about 30% of major rainfall events. And then those ponds and wetlands that beavers create are slowing, spreading, sinking, storing water, right? And certainly a substantial proportion of that 30% is being stored in that floodplain sponge that Leila was talking about. So yeah, I would encourage anybody interested in sort of the floodwater storage connection to kind of check out some of those University of Exeter studies, because those are really interesting and applicable, I think, to North America as well.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for adding that. That's a really good resource. It's also about 21, 22, right? Something like that. But in the there's more work to be done, I think.
Yeah, and this kind of ties into that. You had mentioned, and I'll direct this question to Ben. Leila had mentioned the idea of a sponge, and Ben, you referred back to it, of water under beaver ponds. How does this affect local plants during drought? And could this have an effect on climate change or forest fires or any kind of mass climate that we're seeing in the age of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the person who's addressed that the best is actually our next speaker, Emily Fairfax. And I don't. I'll try to sort of presage her presentation without giving the game away. But what Emily has shown very clearly is that beavers are irrigators, right? And it's not just that floodplain sponge; it's also the canals are really a really important part of this, right? Beavers are these prolific excavators. They dig these canal networks that spread water across the landscape, and in so doing, they're irrigators, and they're turning dry, brown, crispy plants into lush, wet, green ones. And I'm just, sort of stealing Emily's wonderful language for this phenomenon. But in so doing, they create these fantastic fire refugia and fire breaks, which here in the West is so important, right? Obviously, as Emily loves to point out, a wet, green, lush plant is less likely to burn than a dry, brown, crispy one. And in so doing, they're really helping, buffer our landscapes against wildfire and making them more resilient. So Emily, apologies if I butchered that and stole some of your thunder, but I'm really looking forward to your presentation, as I always do, Emily.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, California is really a leader in this with the Beaver Working Group. I mean, they're really thinking intentionally about creating watershed resiliency for wildfire mitigation, and we're all looking forward to Emily's talk later. So I'm sure she's going to talk about this, but it is really interesting to think how much water is kept underground. And, again, I think we're so focused on whatever immediate problem we have, and wildfires, flooding, drought are very visible to us, but species decline is invisible largely until it affects us directly because our crops don't pollinate or something like that. But it is a really a huge problem. I think the statistics that are coming out, I think I was looking this morning, the World Wildlife Planet Report from 2022, which looked at 32,000 species, saw something like 69% of vertebrate decline, which is startling. So, I mean, that's international, but still, we need to think about beaver damming complexes and wetlands as our kind of coral reefs of North America, and value them that way, because no one's put a dollar sign on biodiversity, but when they do, it's going to be astronomical. And we will be thinking about these things in the future, because we're going to be realizing, especially as it gets hotter, that we're going to be needing species for all kinds of things, maybe medicine, maybe, there are going to be a lot of things down the line that are going to come at us that are going to be rationales for making sure species don't go extinct, So I think it's all pointing back to the value of creating habitat for beavers now, I guess.
Great. Yeah, thank you both. And I'm recognizing we have about 1 minute left, but there's a lot of questions about the importance of wetlands. So if you could each give one sentence, starting with Ben, about the importance of wetlands. If you could just sum up in one sentence between beavers and wetlands, what do you want the audience to take away today?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can improve upon Leila's description of beaver complexes coral reefs. That's a really evocative. And now I'll just very briefly say that I'm so grateful to everyone in attendance for engaging in the beaver conversation and for everything you're doing to help restore these animals to their rightful place in North American ecosystems. Your work is really valuable, and everything we can do to support these creatures is essential right now. And I'm grateful to all of you for being part of that conversation.
Thank you, Ben. And Leila, do you have one last sentence that you want to leave our attendees with?
Well, I think one of the things I learned researching and writing Beaverland is that I was really humbled and opened to discover that there are lots of different ways to love beavers other than the way I did. And I think I'm talking really about everything I learned from hunters and fur trappers that really opened my eyes to my surprise. And I think it's really important for us to build bridges and recognize that people can value beavers in different ways that we do. And we're going to need to recognize that to get there together, because we really need everybody at the table. I think that's increasingly important.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Leila, for your presentation. I'd like to remind everyone that if your question wasn't answered, we will be kind of sticking around to answer some questions, and we'll also be sending a follow-up email for that. So that'll conclude our session for today. Once again, we want to thank Ben and Leila for joining us, and they'll be sticking around to chat with you in the chat for a little bit. And stay tuned for our next presentation with Dr. Emily Fairfax to talk more about beavers and climate change.